Blessings of the Triple Gem, Teruan Saranai. We are continuing with our series on profitable perceptions, and this is based on the Buddha's teaching in the Dutiyasaññā Sutta. So this is Anguttara Nikāya chapter 7, discourse number 49. And today's Dhamma session is on the perception of not self in what is suffering, or the perception of not me and mine in what is suffering. So in Pali, this is dukkhe, anattasaññā. Let's begin by paying homage to the Triple Gem. We can bow our heads in Anjali. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dhamma, and homage to the Noble Sangha. As we highlighted in our introductory session, so this was part 1 of this series, we're examining each of the profitable perceptions. And this is to clarify the Buddha's instructions and their meaning, also to understand what they overcome, and how to develop each one referencing other teachings of the Buddha when needed. And then in the final session, we will consolidate them so we can contemplate all 7 profitable perceptions as a single meditation. We're doing this because there is deep Dhamma within each profitable perception that needs to be examined, understood, and then penetrated with right view. And as we highlighted in the last Dhamma session, these profitable perceptions build on each other. They chip away at what we have misapprehended or have been deceived by. As we've seen already from developing and cultivating the earlier profitable perceptions, there is also a high degree of giving up or abandoning of akusala, or unwholesome or unprofitable perceptions, as we lean more strongly towards nibbana. As the Buddha said in the Dutiyasaññā Sutta, because these 7 perceptions, when developed and cultivated, are of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as their consummation. And from the Rāgapeyyāla, these are the abbreviated texts at the end of chapter 7 of Anguttara Nikāya, developing these 7 things helps us to gain direct knowledge of lust or greed and more. Lust or greed cannot be dispelled if we allow unprofitable perceptions to take hold of our mind. It is only by cultivating and developing the profitable perceptions do the unprofitable perceptions shrink, meaning that we are less troubled and we can develop the non-greed path. So far, we've examined the perception of unattractiveness, so this is asubhasaññā, the perception of death, maranasaññā, the perception of repulsiveness of food, ahare, patikulasaññā, and the perception of non-delight in the entire world, dukkhe anattasaññā, and of course the perception of impermanence, anattasaññā. Now, with the remaining 3 profitable perceptions, of which the perception of impermanence is one of them that we've looked at already, there's also the perception of not self in what is suffering, so that's today's meditation, and then lastly the perception of suffering in the impermanent. So what we acknowledge is that we've come to this very pointy end in our development of the profitable perceptions. This means our understanding and penetration of the 3 marks of existence, or sometimes known as the 3 characteristics, namely impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and not self or not me and mine, anatta, is sharpened. So in our last session, which was part 6, we looked at the profitable perception of impermanence, so anattasaññā. So in this session, part 7, we're now focusing on the perception of not self in what is suffering, which enables the mind to become devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body or classes of consciousness and all external objects. With the gradual development of these previous profitable perceptions, we've already touched on impermanency or unlastingness. So if this body, food, or other forms are aging, subject to change and death-bound, then the question we ask is, where is the permanency? We've also looked at feeling and recognized how it's conditioned by contact, which in turn is conditioned by the 6 sense spheres. So if there's aging of the sense bases, sense objects, and sense consciousness, which we'll also look at today, then we also experience aging of feeling. Then we ask again, where is the permanency? And with each session, as we develop these profitable perceptions, we continue to see the sickness or the unprofitable nature of our constructed perceptions. They're built on lies. Now, when we come to the perception of not self in what is suffering as part of developing these 7 profitable perceptions, we need to include these earlier profitable perceptions and what we have understood from these other Dhamma sessions into our contemplation, because it means our baseline is coming from a higher base, not a low one. There is some wisdom that we have already developed that will help us. So in this Dhamma session, we will be deepening our understanding of not self in what is suffering, investigating where we are still holding on to the wrong view, and as a consequence, following the wrong path with rebirth not ended, and that keeps us bound to this suffering, this whole massive suffering. By doing so, by understanding this Dhamma, we will learn how we construct the perception of self, or me and mine, anattasaññā, in what we consider pleasurable, sukha, founded on I-making, mind-making, and conceit. And it's important to see that we came to this current birth having misapprehended self, or me and mine, propped up by this conceit. Out of ignorance and craving, we followed the wrong path. So if we allow the unprofitable or sick perception of not self, or not me and mine, in what is suffering to stand, then we will remain bound to samsara and this whole mass of suffering. So the Buddha is encouraging us to develop this profitable perception of not self in what is suffering, so that we can transcend I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects. Let's now deep dive into what the Buddha has said about the perception of not self in what is suffering in this Dutiyasaññā Sutta. It was said, the perception of not self in what is suffering, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of not self in what is suffering, his mind is devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects. It has transcended discrimination and is peaceful and well liberated. The first thing to do is to admit that this profitable perception of not self in what is suffering, dukkhe anattasaññā, is not how we usually perceive this conscious body or classes of consciousness and all external objects. As we've said throughout earlier sessions, if we go one by one, we also don't have active the perception of unattractiveness, asubhasaññā. We don't have active the perception of death, maranasaññā. We don't have active the perception of repulsiveness of food, ahara patikulasaññā. We don't have active the perception of non-delight in the entire world, sabaloke anattasaññā. Nor do we have active the perception of impermanence, aniccasaññā. What is usually active are the lies. It's like the truth is there, but it's covered up by fancy or decorative wrapping that continues to deceive us. It's only when we do our formal meditation that we start to unblock ourselves from that. This is what usually is operating in the mind, so all these lies or deceptions. So when we contemplate the Buddha's words and insight pathways, that's when the lies subside and the truth can be seen as it really is. So when these unprofitable perceptions or lies are present, we think from what we've taken as attractive, so subha, and permanent, nicca, that there's pleasure or happiness, sukha, and so we think that it's fit to be regarded as me and mine or self. So in this case, what we're saying, or what the Buddha is saying, is then our mind is imbued with what the Buddha calls ahankara, so I-making, mamankara, mind-making, and conceit, mana, we're always measuring. And we're regarding that these 6 classes of consciousness and all external objects are wrapped up in that. So here we can even connect to the words of the Buddha we're familiar with. Think about how in the Ānanda Sutta, so Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 159, and also there are numerous other similar discourses where the Buddha would ask the monks and nuns, if form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, so the 5 aggregates, are permanent or impermanent? And the answer they would give is impermanent. And then the Buddha would ask if what is impermanent is suffering or happiness. And the answer, of course, would be suffering. Then the Buddha would ask, is what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, fit to be regarded as me and mine, or self? Or as the sutta here says, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. And the answer they would give is no. So that's the meditation we're familiar with, where we say, if it is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, is it really worth taking as me and mine or self? Our usual tendency when our awareness or clear comprehension is absent is to think of these five aggregates as permanent, pleasurable, not subject to change, and therefore we regard them as me and mine. We take the five aggregates as something of substance, having value to us, that should be taken as me and mine. So when we develop the profitable perceptions in this Dutiyasaññā Sutta, what we find is that if we develop sequentially and contemplate this Dhamma in sequence and apply our own examples, we build a very strong base of wisdom, and we reject the unprofitable way of thinking. And it's a wisdom teaching. So our usual tendency or mode of seeing things is abolished. So it's important to remember that we bring forward these earlier profitable perceptions into this session. Let's now take a closer look at the Buddha's words. So it's the same slide as before. So initially the Buddha says, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of not self in what is suffering, his mind is devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects. It has transcended discrimination and is peaceful and well liberated. So this statement does appear in other suttas. So for example, in the Buddha's teaching to Venerable Rahula, so this is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 18, discourses 21 and 22, and also to Venerable Ānanda in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 3, discourse number 32. And they had specific questions to the Buddha about when one doesn't identify or construct the self or me and mine. And what is important for us to understand from the Buddha's words is how these Dhamma paths show how we identify or construct the perception of self, anattasaññā. And the Buddha has called out these components as I-making, ahankara, mind-making, mamankara, and conceit, mana, regarding this conscious body and all external objects. So let's look at how this works. Firstly, let's examine I-making, ahankara. So in the Pitaka Disclosure or Pethakopadesa, chapter 5, it says in Pali, bhavan, bogancha, vokaro, ahankarasa, padathanang, which can be translated as existence, so that's the bhava, possessions, which includes property or wealth, so that's bhoga, and with the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, which is the vokara, and that's the footing for I-making. So what does this mean? It means we internally construct or make this sense of I or me through three things, bhava, bhoga, and vokaro, so existence, possession, and with the complete surmounting of perceptions of form. So let's look at these one by one. First, we have existence, bhava. This would be how we identify internally with our appearance, our gender, our race, the type of family we're born into, our status in life, our education, our career, our position of authority, our roles, our culture, and so on. So there's a narrative in our mind which sounds like, I am someone who is born to this family, this gender, this status, this orientation, these looks, this role, this position, these attributes. We can think of these as connected with feeling. We are happy to exist with these things we've identified with, consider valuable, and the pleasurable feeling we think we gain. Then we have bhoga, possessions, and this includes our property or wealth. So bhoga would be how we internally identify with our land, our property, our vehicles, our assets, our spouse and children, other family members, our pets, our gold, our Bitcoin, our share portfolio, the cash in the bank, and whatever other jewelry and clothes and food and so on. Again, there's a narrative in our mind which sounds like, I'm someone with this much wealth, these kinds of property and assets and possessions, who can afford these kinds of things. We think of these as connected with material objects, so form or physical nutriment. We've internally identified with and we consider them valuable. And thirdly, we have with the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, vokaro. So this definition for vokaro comes from the guide or Netipakarana, and in particular, chapter 21. So this would be how we internally identify with our meditation abilities, where we're able to completely transcend perceptions of form which means our ability to attain to the arupa concentration. So the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, and so on. And here again, there's a narrative in our mind which sounds like, I am someone who can reach these higher concentrations with ease and abide there. So I-making has this way of internally gathering these three component parts to construct I am such and such a person. Now, if we bring in conceit or mana, things start to get really interesting. As we know, conceit is one of the higher fetters, and we meditate on that when we look at the Vatupama Sutta, the Anumana Sutta, to try and abandon this particular mental stain. But it's actually a higher fetter, so we only completely abandon it when we realize Nibbana. Now, in the Kema Sutta, this is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 6, discourse number 49, Venerable Kema said to the Buddha, Bhante, when a bhikkhu is an arahant, one whose taints are destroyed, who has lived the spiritual life, done what had to be done, laid down the burden, reached his own goal, utterly destroyed the fetters of existence, one completely liberated through final knowledge, it does not occur to him, there is someone better than me, or there is someone equal to me, or there is someone inferior to me. This is what Venerable Kema said, and the teacher agreed. So what we see here are the three kinds of conceit that Venerable Kema is referring to. This is how the Buddha would often teach about conceit. When we don't see things as they really are, that conditions are impermanent and suffering, we usually regard or think, I am superior, or I am equal, or I am inferior. As we shall see, these different kinds of conceit are not a good thing because it becomes the support for constructing this perception of self, or this sense of me and mine, anattasaññā. Even when we examine the word in Pali for conceit, mana, it has this sense of measurement or taking measure in its translation. We take an internal measure of ourselves, seeing our own distinction or difference from others, and we're conditioned to operate from this kind of discrimination. But if we were to consider that there's no differences, a certain kind of equality, such as we're all born subject to aging, sickness, and death, there's no permanency for everyone and everything, then what would we have to be conceited about? Even understanding this, we can see the recipe for suffering, not pleasure. So let's look at how conceit arises across the three parts that are the footing for I-making, leading to the perception of self. Firstly, when it comes to existence, bhava, we might have the conceit about our appearance, the family we're born to, our status, our education, our qualifications, our roles, and so much more. So in one case, we might be thinking, I'm inferior because I come from a poor or working class upbringing, or I'm inferior because I haven't established myself in the world yet, or I'm inferior because of my youth, or I'm a recovering alcoholic, inferior to those who can handle alcohol. Or another case would be where we think I'm an educated person who is equal to those who have graduated from college or university, or I'm equal to the upper class of society because of my wealthy and elite family that I was born into, or I'm a mother who is equal to those who are also mothers. And then another way would be I'm superior because I'm still youthful and attractive, even at my age compared to my peers. Or I'm superior because I've renunciated lay life and ordained as a monk or a nun. Or I'm superior because I can still travel the world despite old age, while my peers can't. Or I'm superior because I was born to this elite family with power. So that's in relation to bhava, in terms of existence. So I can exist this way, and I'm conceited about my kind of existence and the feeling, the pleasure I get from this in that distinction. Then the second one is bhoga, when it comes to possessions or property or our wealth. So we might have conceit regarding, as we said before, land, property, vehicles, assets, family members, pets, all kinds of different situations in regard to wealth and property. So we might be thinking on the one hand, I'm inferior because I don't even own a house, or I'm inferior because I'm sinking in debt, or I'm inferior to those monks or nuns who receive a lot of requisites. Or we might be thinking I'm equal to my peers who worked hard and have a decent home, car, and solid investment portfolio. Or I'm equal to those monks and nuns who've been offered land for a monastery or funds to expand the monastery. Or we might be thinking, I'm superior because I'm successful in my business and have material wealth. Or I'm superior because my children graduated from Ivy League schools. Or I'm superior because I have a large following of rich lay supporters who offer the best requisites to me and my monasteries. Or I'm superior because I got Bitcoin really early when it was $8 a Bitcoin. So in that case, what we think is, yes, because of these possessions and property, and the conceit around our particular situation, that it constructs this perception of self. It's one of those things. And when it comes to the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, vokaro, we might have conceit regarding our meditation abilities. So on one hand, we might be thinking, I'm inferior because I can't even attain to the base of infinite space. Or on the other hand, we might be thinking, I'm equal to those who can reach the base of infinite consciousness. Not many people are able to reach there, but I belong to the group that can. I'm the same as them. Or we might be thinking, I'm superior because I can completely transcend the perceptions of form and attain all the arupa concentrations at will with no trouble or difficulty. I'm superior to many, and I belong to that elite group. So what we can see here is that conceit reinforces I-making, that sense of self, the sense of I am. If there's no distinction or difference between how we measure and identify ourselves against others, then there would be no conceit. It's only if there's distinction or inequality in how we measure that conceit arises in support of I-making. So for example, if we're conceited about our youth or beauty, but everyone else is similarly youthful or beautiful, there's no distinction between any of us. Then there wouldn't be anything to be conceited about. Or say we're conceited about our wealth or property, but everyone has exactly the same wealth and property as us. Then again, there would be nothing to be conceited about. Or we're conceited about our meditation ability to attain to the arupa concentrations. But everybody else has exactly the same ability and able to abide there for a long time, similar to us. Then again, there would be nothing to be conceited about. So what we're saying is when we have conceit about existence, bhava, property, bhoga, and the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, vokara, we get I-making. So the Pethakopadesa in chapter 8 also says, or actually it's chapter 5, also says that Salayatanang ahankarasa padattanang, which translates as the sixfold base is the footing for I-making. So this is where we start looking at the conscious body, because the sixfold base is referring to the eye and forms, ear and sounds, nose and odors, tongue and flavors, body and tangibles, and mind and mental phenomena. So we know the combination of sense-based, sense object, and sense consciousness constitutes what the Buddha refers to as conscious body, this saviññānaka kaya. And this is what is referred to in this Dutiyasaññā Sutta. So kaya can be translated as body or classes, groups, or collections. And saviññānaka can be translated as conscious or with consciousness or having sense perception. So instead of conscious body, which sometimes confuses people in the translation, saviññānaka kaya are the collections or classes of sense consciousness. So what we're talking about are these 6 classes of sense consciousness. So in the Chacaka Sutta, which we have here, this is from Majjhima Nikaya Discourse number 148, the Buddha has taught eye consciousness, depending on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. So it was with reference to this that it was said the 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. Now, if we can remember, we've actually previously spoken about this in a number of instances, but in particular to upadhi, acquisitions. that these 6 classes of consciousness, or this conscious body, are one of the 10 acquisitions that we ultimately want to relinquish in order to completely realize liberation. And why is this relevant to eye-making? It's because of the Paticca or dependent origination. When we have contact as condition, there is feeling, which we misapprehend as pleasurable. So contact arises based on these 6 classes of consciousness, dependent on the 6 sense bases and 6 sense objects. Buddha often taught about the aging nature, the disintegrating nature, so palokita, of these things. So they cannot be relied upon. There's no refuge in any of these things. They only lead to suffering. But unless we contemplate, we don't see that. We go towards feeling, expecting sukha. And with feeling as condition, craving. And so this is what we know as contact affected by the taints. Sasava passo. So the perception of pleasure, this sukha-saññā, has the characteristic of pursuing this kind of contact affected by the taints. If it was correctly apprehended as suffering, as dukkhe, by seeing the impermanent nature, we wouldn't do this. And when you really understand about how the ayatanas work, how contact comes to arise, then, and you really understand jara dhamma, the aging nature, then you also wouldn't see it as sukha. So with craving as condition, there's clinging, we know this. And with clinging as condition, there's existence, we know this. We put money into the money box. And with existence as condition, birth. So with birth as condition, aging and death, and this whole massive suffering. So we allow dependent origination to happen. So we've talked about this through the Samādhi-bhāvanā Sutta, through even how we've understood what's behind the Karaniya Metta Sutta. It's very important to see that when we don't identify in this way, if we don't keep constructing in this way through perceptions and volition, then what happens is we stop this paticca, this dependent origination from happening. And what's very important is to actually see suffering rather than pleasure, correcting that view. If there's aging, then there's sickness and death. So where is the permanency? It all results in suffering, the rising and passing away of suffering. So if we go back to Petkopadesa, and in, I think it's chapter 6, it says, Dhamesu upagamana lakkhana anattasaññā tassa ahankaro padattanam, which can be translated as the perception of self or me and mine has the characteristic of pursuing or approaching wrong dhammas or ideas. Its footing is eye-making. So what does that mean? Well, eye-making is the footing for the perception of self or perceiving as me and mine, and it has this characteristic of pursuing wrong ideas, wrong dhammas. So what are these wrong dhammas or ideas? So this is what we're constructing through our perceptions and volition. So, for example, if we're wealthy and become conceited, what we pursue are the things that made us reach that level. So it could be business dealings or networks or chasing promotions or certain investments at a worldly level. But it could also be from a dharmic perspective about generosity, our meritorious deeds, because we know the fruit of generosity is wealth. So what happens is we keep pursuing that, thinking we want to do that over and over again because we want to be wealthy and remain wealthy and have wealth in the future. And so we start pursuing these wrong ideas, which are part of eye-making that lead to the perception of self or me and mine. So what this is saying is that when we pursue the wrong ideas, even those that are meritorious, we develop this wrong view of self, me and mine, and we develop the wrong path that leads to rebirth and suffering, and it doesn't lead to nibbana. And so what we've said before when we looked at karma and rebirth is that rebirth is seen as akusala. It's unwholesome. So when you look at these profitable perceptions, it's very important. This is Arya Dhamma. This is the noble path. Our goal is Nibbana. Nibbana is our object. And it's not seeking rebirth. So even when we think, oh, it's really good to keep doing meritorious things, but it's still reminding us that that's mundane right view, seeking rebirth. And so when we think about the supramundane right view, we're not doing that. We're actually going towards Nibbana because Nibbana is safe. Nibbana, there's no more suffering. Let's now look at mind-making, sometimes also referred to as my-making. So this is mamankara in Pali. In the Pethakopadesa, chapter 8, it states in Pali, Sarato manikundalesu mamankarasa padatana, which can be translated as that someone has intense desire for jewels and gems is the footing for mind-making. And then it goes on, Saratta chitto manikundalesu yo ahankare visatto mamankare visatto yo putadare sarato ketevattu samim sarato, which can be translated as one whose mind has intense desire for jewels and gems is attached in regard to eye-making, attached in regard to mind-making, and also has intense desire for children and wives and intense desire for fields and lands. So if we have this intense desire, sarato, for jewels and gems or any material objects, external objects we assign value to, we're attached in regard to both eye-making and mind-making. There's a connection there. And we also have an intense desire for families, properties, and land. I mean, that does make sense. If you look at it conventionally, we're taught to go out into the world and gather wealth. So these are the material objects that are considered valuable. And then we're told to find a partner and grow a family and to keep building in that regard. So you can see that we're given or conditioned with this intense desire that this is how you're meant to live your life. So interestingly, the Pitaka disclosure also says in chapter 8 that those who have the desire for nibbana will abandon craving for children and wives. So in other words, if we have the desire for nibbana, we give up those attachments and bonds to families and groups and all that's associated with maintaining families and groups, which is property, wealth, and possessions. But isn't this where we find ourselves? That we all have very strong attachments and bonds to me and my family or group, me and my assets and wealth, in whatever form that takes, depending on what we assign value to. And so we certainly don't do this. So we certainly do this internally. So we mentally go about this life, constructing through eye-making this perception of self. And we then pursue it externally, which is part of mind-making. So this again in Pethakopadesa, chapter 5, it says, Bahiranang parigaho mamankarasa padattanang. So this is translated as appropriation of external objects is a footing for mind-making. So when there is eye-making, I am such and such a person with intense desire and attachments to family, to position, to status, to belongings and wealth, then we get the mind-making. Let me go and seek those things externally. And when I acquire those external objects, then I think I'm happy. That's how we get the perception of pleasure. And of course, the sense of self or me and mine gets reinforced. So as we said earlier, with the perception of pleasure, we keep pursuing contact affected by the taints. So this is something that an arahant does not do, but anyone who hasn't attained to the fruit of arahantship then and has cut off the taints, then we literally do this day in and day out. So each day we run the script or narrative for eye-making in our mind, usually in the background and coming to the forefront as and when it's called upon. And it's also conventionally acceptable to run these narratives and compare ourselves in this misapprehended way. It's socially acceptable. Everybody does it. But it's very important to investigate and see this in our meditation and to see why we need to give this up. So for example, on a day-to-day basis, we operate from, I'm born to this kind of family, I went to this kind of school, I married this kind of person, my kids are doing this and that, I have this kind of wealth and property, I have plans regarding all these things, I'm connected to these different networks in the world, I have this kind of ability with my meditation, and I can abide in certain places for a length of time. And naturally what arises is a certain conceit around it, whether we're inferior, the same, or superior. And so because of eye-making, because we operate from this narrative, and because we make plans around that as well, we get this perception of self, and we validate it externally. So We do this through mind making or mind making, and we'll make certain things like I'll go and invest in this. I'll go send my kids to that kind of place. I'll take my family to this kind of place. I'll buy this asset, and so on, so on and so on. So when we do all these things, what we end up thinking is what we've constructed is great. And actually externally, it gets validated as well, because people with ignorance don't understand this concoction, this dire predicament that we're in. And so when we take that kind of praise, that kind of endorsement externally from people who are not developing the Noble Eightfold Path, then this perception of pleasure gets stronger. And so we keep going on and on like this, not seeing any danger. So what we're really running on a daily basis is the unprofitable perception of dukkhe anattasaññā, so pleasure in what is self, or me and mine. And we can keep pursuing those wrong ideas in support of that. So the perception of self, anattasaññā, takes perception and volition too tightly. It deludedly believes in what it has constructed, and it is constructing, and it ignores the fatal flaws. It doesn't see what is impermanent, suffering, subject to change, is not worth taking as me and mine or self. So if this is the case, then we'll keep transmigrating in samsara. We are valuing what is outside of nibbana. We need to remember from past meditations, such as the Samādhi-bhāvanā Sutta. This is the Samyutta Nikaya discourse number 5 of chapter 22, that there is no safety in that. All we can expect is the arising and passing away of suffering over and over again. When we previously examined the perception of impermanence, so this anattasaññā, and particularly the arising and passing away of perception, we saw sickness, the lies in our perceptions. When we take beauty or attractive, subha, in what is unattractive, it's really asubha, and permanent, nicca, in what is impermanent, anicca, and so on. So now we really see the sickness or lies in the perception of self, in what is not self, how we construct that, and also the perception of pleasure in what is suffering. When we contemplate these profitable perceptions, we are effectively correcting these perversions or corruptions in the mind in a very methodical, very sequential way at the level of perception, and then also thought and view. So in this meditation, with the perception of impermanence strongly developed or well established, then we understand it as suffering, not pleasure. We are death-bound. Our loved ones are death-bound. The objects we value are death-bound. Even attaining to the higher concentrations are death-bound. We cannot abide anywhere with any stability or safety. It's all unlasting. So it is suffering. It's not pleasurable. And when this is firmly established, what we need to do is contemplate and understand the Dhamma parts that form I-making. So bhava, bhoga, vokara. So existence, property, and transcending of the perceptions of form. And any conceit that we have towards this conscious body and external objects. So we need to take our own examples to connect with this Dhamma. So I went through some examples of how we do that. So take your own examples. So if we can abandon I-making and conceit, then the perception of self doesn't happen. And in our meditation, if we don't appropriate anything externally as mine, which also means we abandon the pursuit of contact affected by the taints, it means we don't allow dependent origination to happen. So all of that is cut off. So when we understand all these Dhamma parts, this is how we develop dukkhe anattasaññā, or the perception of not self in what is suffering. In this profitable perception, the Buddha hasn't given any simile for us to apply, but what he said is, if we often develop the perception of not self in what is suffering, where our mind is free of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body or classes of consciousness and all external objects, it has transcended discrimination and is peaceful and well liberated, having given up. So the Pali word for discrimination is viddha, which can also be translated as a synonym for conceit, where we measure or assign value. So if we continue to measure and identify with differences, then we don't overcome discrimination, and the mind remains restless and certainly won't get peaceful. So we're far from liberation. But if we develop dukkhe anattasaññā following the Buddha's instructions, and we give up the conceit where we think I'm less than, or I'm the same as, or I'm better than, then this is something that would be really powerful. So in a deeper sense, this contemplation is really helping us to shrink away from name and form, namarupa. In this way, the mind becomes very peaceful, very calm. Okay, so if we continue with the Dutiyasaññā Sutta, the Buddha has said, if when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of not self in what is suffering, his mind is not devoid of eye-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects. If it does not transcend discrimination and become peaceful and well-liberated, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of not self in what is suffering. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. So similar to the earlier perceptions, the Buddha has given us a method to correct or to check whether we've developed this perception of not self in what is suffering correctly. Here he said, if we have done our meditation, contemplating eye-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects, and our mind still inclines towards discrimination, so measuring, and it remains restless, then we know that our mind hasn't become calm and well liberated. So we should understand we haven't developed this perception of not self in what is suffering correctly, or the way we have contemplated or applied the Dhamma is wrong or incomplete. And this is because there's no difference in the mind before and after our meditation or contemplation. So naturally, there's no fruit of development. So if this is the case, then it's good to go back and review where we might have gone wrong. Maybe we haven't fully given up the three parts that form eye-making, which leads to the perception of self. Maybe we haven't given up mind-making or its footing in appropriating external objects. Maybe there's something we're protective of or very strongly identified with. Maybe the conceit hasn't been abandoned, and so it's obstructing us. Or we're still holding on to perceptions that are sick, that are lies. Maybe we haven't established the perception of impermanence and seen that it is suffering at the forefront of this meditation. Whatever the case may be, it's important to correct any flaws in our contemplation, because otherwise there'll be no fruit of development. And we allow that unprofitable perception to stand. So the dukkhe anattasaññā, that there is self in what is pleasurable. And so this is a very important point, that we mustn't incline towards discrimination or measuring, valuing something outside of nibbana. So in this way, that's how we develop the mind. And then the Buddha has said, but if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of not self in what is suffering, and his mind is devoid of eye-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects, and if it has transcended discrimination and become peaceful and well liberated, he should understand, I have developed the perception of not self in what is suffering. There is distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. So in contrast to the previous passage, after contemplating, if the mind has transcended discrimination and the mind does become calm and peaceful and well liberated, then we know that we've developed the perception of not self in what is suffering correctly, because there's a difference between our mind before our meditation and after. And in this case, there would be fruit of development. Now, with the understanding of impermanence and suffering well established, we give up eye-making, mind-making, conceit regarding the conscious body and external elements. We're no longer measuring. I think that's the key thing. We're no longer measuring and assigning value. We're not discriminating as we would have previously done. And it's quite a contrast to what we would usually do. We're not identifying and attaching to anyone or anything that is deceiving us, particularly in this meditation. Essentially, we more deeply understand if it is unlasting or impermanent, suffering and subject to change, it's really not worth taking as me and mine or self. So if we've attained fruit of development, then we're happy to know that we've developed well. When it was said, the perception of not self in what is suffering, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having deathless as its consummation. It is because of this that this was said. So the Buddha has confirmed that when we develop and cultivate the perception of not self in what is suffering, it is of great fruit and benefit because Nibbana is its final goal and accomplishment. So having seen through the sickness or lies, having removed I-making and mind-making and conceit regarding this conscious body or classes of consciousness and all external objects, we don't value and take anything outside of Nibbana. We have Nibbana as the object and Nibbana as our goal. We've now come to the end of our session on the 6th of the 7 profitable perceptions, which is the perception of not self in what is suffering, so dukkhe anattasaññā. Let's express our gratitude to the Buddha for these powerful teachings. Let's also express gratitude to our other teachers, parents, good friends, all those who encourage us on the Noble Eightfold Path. We can now share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem to all of you. Wishing you all well. May you continue to develop and progress on the Noble Eightfold Path and grow in wholesome qualities. Teruvan Saranai.